what's going on in Chile? Explain to us what's going on there. What the hell's going on?
Wow, a lot is going on, and I imagine you're referring specifically to the latest elections, which were held about a week and a half ago.
Yes.
Well, these elections were, received most attention because Chileans were electing delegates to a constituent assembly, right, that will redraft the country's constitution. But there were also local and gubernatorial elections. For the first time, there were provincial elections in Chile. But of course, most of the attention has been paid, correctly so, to the outcome of the constituent elections and the very fact that these elections were held in the first place. And the best way to describe what occurred is it's a veritable earthquake that has shattered really the foundations of the old political regime in Chile. This is the regime that emerged out of the dictatorship and the transition, the post-authoritarian transition that occurred in 88, 89, and that ruled over Chile ever since, primarily, under center-left governments. So what these elections have done essentially has been to shatter, right, the old partisan system, the old political system, and open for the first time, in over 4 decades, the possibility of more substantive democratic reform in the country.
Mark Fisher talks about the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile as the sort of opening salvo of the neoliberal era, like that it's like where the neoliberalism kind of begins, a good place to kind of start it officially. And Chile, for many decades, like in places like The Economist magazine and whatever, has been held up as a kind of model of a free market economy and just how well everything goes there. It's like a decent place to live and the thing, and woohoo, great job. Is that picture an accurate one, that the sort of free market reforms that Chile is famous for, does that create a really decent, healthy society where everyone is just happy?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because that's fundamentally what was at play here, what was in question during these elections, and not just this round of elections. I mean, Chile has been going through a cycle of mass mobilization and rejection of this model, right, for about the past 10 years. And it really, really intensified and exploded in October of 2019. But going back to your question, right, Chile's been celebrated, as the poster child of neoliberalism, I think precisely because it allegedly combined 2 things that we all love, right? Prosperity and democracy. And there's some truth actually to both of those assessments, but they're just wildly incomplete. In terms of prosperity, Chile received this attention as the miracle, the South American miracle. In the 90s, Chileans took to calling ourselves los jaguares del Pacífico, the jaguars of the Pacific. Because Chile did experience, very, very robust growth rates from beginning of the late 80s under the dictatorship into the 2000s, averaging about 5% yearly growth rates, with some years hitting, up to 8, 9, 10%. The result of that was an overall increase in living standards, and you can measure that by just looking at GDP per capita, which for formerly poor country, now an OECD country, right, reached about $17,000 per year. So on paper, it looked like the model had in fact delivered prosperity across the board, because you had these, compared to the rest of Latin America, fairly spectacular looking growth and per capita income rates. Of course, if you dig a little further, what you find is that Chile, by the same token, was characterized by just massive levels of inequality, and also huge levels of popular and social insecurity. There was a big chunk of the population that received very low wages, somewhere between 40 and 30%, if you look at it the other way, 30 to 40% of Chileans continue to work in the informal market, so don't have secure employment, for income and to feed their families. And for many people, they had to assume risk on their own, risk in terms of getting healthcare, risk in terms of sending their kids to decent schools. And another thing that became a huge problem was the living conditions of elderly people, because pensions have been privatized, and about 70% of retired elderly workers in Chile make under half of the minimum wage. So they can't even, they can barely scrape by. So that's what was happening in terms of on the socioeconomic front. In terms of, political democracy, again, things weren't as rosy as The Economist, the New York Times, and many Chileans themselves, elite Chileans, try to paint the picture. Chile ended up, undeniably, of course, transitioned from a military dictatorship into a liberal democracy with, civil and political rights and free elections, and that's all something that needs to be recognized. But it ended up producing an oligarchic system in which two main coalitions, the center-right and the center-left, pretty much traded power. The dominant coalition was the center-left, originally called the Concertación, which was in power for 20 years straight. But they pretty much shared power and became the, as I said, oligarchs of the political system, making all policy decisions and excluding the vast majority of Chileans who felt alienated, who didn't feel represented. And you can get a picture of that kind of crisis of representation by looking at voter turnout rates. In the first democratic elections in Chile, 90%, talking about 89, 90% of registered voters came out to vote. By 2017, so after almost 30 years of this, under 40%, around 40% of the population was bothering to even vote. So, as even in the political realm, turned out to be not a very representative state, and that's what led to this massive crisis of legitimacy.
Right. To just follow up at that point, and I want to actually read something that you wrote in a recent Catalyst piece titled Chile's Democratic Revolution. So beyond just the voter turnout, since 2002, the figure for those reporting scant or zero trust in ruling parties has hovered around 40% or higher. In other words, just over 10 years into the transition, the vast majority of Chileans, the same proportion that has now voted to rewrite the Constitution, had lost faith in all parties. And so I guess the question is effectively like, why? Why did they lose faith? And then maybe even more important for us, more concretely, why did for instance, working people lose faith in the left parties? That this is, we see these massive demonstrations over the last couple of years, and it's somewhat more of it's coming from working people. It's not coming from political parties. There's somewhat of a disconnect between the actions on the ground and the left institutionally and in party formation. So I'm curious what leads us to that situation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I actually try to answer that question, which is quite complex, obviously, and it deals with, a long kind of span of time and a lot of factors going into it, I do want to highlight something that was embedded in your question. As I said earlier, the dominant force in Chilean post-authoritarian politics has been the center-left. The center-left in Chile includes the Socialist Party, right? This is the party of Allende, of Salvador Allende, who was deposed in the 1973 coup, right? This is the party that tried to make a democratic, Chilean road to real socialism, right? And so many people might think that as the party of Allende, once it came to power, and it was, it started off as the junior partner in the center-left coalition, the major partner were the Christian Democrats. But by 2000, it had really become the strongest party within the center-left coalition. And so one might ask, suspect that, with the socialists in power, with Michelle Bachelet being elected twice, right, in power, this would be a pro-labor government. This would be a pro-working class and pro-poor government. And so I think it shocks many people to see just how thorough and deep the popular rejection of the Concertación has become. And, the reason is that, in very, very simple terms, this was not a party of labor. This was not a party of the poor, as it had been under Allende. This was a neoliberal party dominated by elites, and that governed the party for elites, right? There's no way around that. Part of it is due to the manner in which the transition occurred, in which, in order to restore democracy, this new center-left political class had to agree to leave the basic rules of the game, the basic market rules of the game intact, right? But part of it is also because of how this party had refashioned itself, has transformed itself, and has deliberately, right, continued to fragment and weaken labor and popular sectors, and has instead woven very direct, very chummy ties with the country's business elite. And so that resulted in, all of the indicators that I listed in a somewhat disorganized fashion earlier on. That resulted, for instance, in privatized pensions, and therefore no kind of real material security for elderly people in Chile. That resulted in the continuation of privatized healthcare, right? Where most Chileans don't have security when it comes to being insured or receiving proper healthcare. That resulted, for instance, in labor legislation that has been completely in favor of employers and has undermined the ability of workers to organize and to bargain collectively. The result of all of that has been a fractured society, right? Where with massive wealth accumulated at the top and massive material insecurity at the bottom.
I want to ask about this constitutional convention. I want to ask about the makeup of it and who are these people who are writing the Constitution? Yeah. How do you write a Constitution? Do you just start writing? Seems like very difficult and complicated to get everyone to agree. I'm just imagining what a constitutional convention would look like in this country, like in 2021, and it seems like it would be utter chaos. So, what is that process going to look like? What do you expect to be in it, and who is deciding what's in it?
Yeah, and even before I think answering this question, I should go back to something I said earlier. When I said that this new center or center-left political class, right, made a series of pacts as it negotiated the transition back to democracy, one of them was to inherit, as it were, the constitution that was imposed through corruption and coercion under Pinochet. So the constitution, which has governed Chile since the return to democracy, has been, the constitution imposed in 1980 by the military regime. And so that is the constitution which pretty much became the target of mass fury, mass resentment that exploded onto the streets in 2019, right, in this popular rebellion that lasted for weeks and that the regime could not put down through force. It could not contain. It could not. It found no ways of getting, young people and workers off the streets and keep them from rioting on the streets. And so, in November of 2019, the center-right government under Piñera, right, feeling this pressure from the street. Santiago was burning, and not just Santiago, but many towns and cities up and down the country. So at that point, it made this huge concession. It negotiated with all factions in parliament, including a new left that has emerged in Chile called the Frente Amplio, and agreed to hold a plebiscite in which Chileans were asked whether they wanted even to, a new constitution, and how the new constitution would be written. So as a result of that, in October of last year, right, 80% of Chileans voted to reject the old constitution and for a constituent assembly that would rewrite the constitution. Now, the elections to choose delegates to this assembly was postponed on a couple of occasions because of the pandemic. But now that it was held, the results are really not only fascinating, but quite shocking. Shocking in the sense that they portend complete overhaul of Chile's political system. The two dominant coalitions, the center-right and the center-left, were just crushed. The center-right knew it would lose badly, and it was hoping to win a third of the votes so it could veto any major transformations. It only won 20% of the vote. The real loser, however, in the elections is the center-left, the old Concertación, the Christian Democrats and the Socialists primarily. And it stands to reason. They, as I said earlier, they have been the bulwark of the regime, of the post-authoritarian neoliberal regime. They simply got trounced. I think they got something like 14% of the vote. To give you an indication of the magnitude of their defeat, the Christian Democrats, which used to be the strongest party, right, in the 90s and into the early 2000s, they elected 2 delegates out of 155, just 2 delegates. I mean, it's just a major rejection and thrashing. And alongside of that defeat, of the defeat of those 2 regime forces, you see the emergence of new political forces. Primarily, and I think most encouraging, is the emergence of a coalition between the Communist Party, which had been totally relegated to the margins of Chilean politics up until very recently, a coalition between the communists and this new left force, the Frente Amplio. They came together, ran shared slates, and elected about 20% of the delegates, right? So did as well, if not better than the old ruling coalitions. And along with this new left bloc that has emerged, a number of independent slates and lists did quite well with them. Most encouraging of these is what's called the Lista del Pueblo, which is a series of fairly motley slates that social movements and grassroots organizations put together, and they received close to 15% of the vote. So these are the folks who are going to come together and within a year draft the new constitution. There are a number of rules that we might want to get into them if you want, right? But the interesting thing and the promising development again is that the old oligarchs, the old mainstays of the democratic neoliberal regime, are now minorities and have been tremendously weakened.
We should do the new rules. What are the new rules?
Well, I'm just going to mention a couple because they received a lot of attention. Mm-hmm. One actually had an ironic outcome. One of the rules that was put in place, both for putting together slates, list of candidates, and then for actually electing delegates, right, that will be drafting the Constitution, is the gender parity rule, right? At least half of candidates had to be women, and at least half of elected delegates, through whatever formula they had to be women as well. Turns out that I guess most political forces, even the right in Chile, has no problem fielding women candidates. it turns out that men actually benefited from this rule more than women, because more women were elected than men. So to reach parity, some of the women had to be removed and men had to be
right.
raised.
It's about time. It's about damn time.
Well, I think it's interesting because, you know, Chile has experienced over the last few years huge feminist mobilizations. You know, at least that's how they're called, and they've had these massive days of demonstrations. We're up to, I think last year, up to 2 million women hit the streets. It was really impressive, right? And so there is a sense, right, that gender equality in a very, very sexist country, I mean, there's no way around that, right, has been forced onto the agenda. And it will, you know, gender oppression, it has to be dealt with. What I find somewhat surprising, again, is that the parties from right to left, right, actually took this on fairly naturally. They didn't really have to, it wasn't a big imposition for them, right? And so we'll see how that plays out. Another similar thing is indigenous representation. There are, I think, 11 seats reserved for not just the Mapuche, which is the major kind of indigenous population in Chile, but all indigenous groups. And that's a good thing because, you know, most of these communities and populations have been involved in local grassroots campaigns against multinational corporations, right, and have developed high levels of organization and programmatically, right, point toward, I think, and we'll be fighting for universalist demands for everyone. So I think the left and popular forces will definitely count on their, you know, on working with them, can count on working with them. The other big and controversial rule, right, that came out of that November agreement between Piñera and most groups in parliament was that for big changes you need super majorities, right, to ratify these new elements of the Constitution. And so that meant that, you know, 1/3 of a bloc that controls only 1/3 of the delegates could veto, as I said earlier, major transformations. We'll see what happens. Things are in such flux right now, particularly for the two dominant old coalitions, right? That we'll have to keep an eye on, particularly the old concertacionistas, and in particular, I mentioned that the Christian Democrats, just they've really been relegated to the dustbin of Chile's political history. But the Socialist Party somehow, and I still don't quite understand why, they actually elected 14 representatives, 14 delegates. It's going to be very hard for them to, I think, band with the right. All the pressure from the street and from their own constituencies, to the extent that they still have any, right, mass constituencies, will push them to ally with this new left and independent delegates to, you know, vote in the types of basic legal foundations that the population really wants. And here what we're talking about is not just political democratic rights, but social and economic rights as well.
Right. Well, so what's interesting both in that and whether it be the plebiscite or you mentioned kind of the feminist movement in Chile, so much of the actual political manifestations have come through people going to the streets, that it's been protest action. And it's something of a global phenomenon, obviously, that we just saw a year of protests around racial justice, Black Lives Matter in the US, but also kind of, you know, regionally specific variants of that across the globe in all different countries. And I'm curious, I mean, because you have a critique of like maybe the limitations of protests, and I was wondering if we can get into that, because you have a quote. I want to read just one more quote from that same Catalyst piece that I brought up earlier, where you say that it was not realistic to think of toppling the government via unending street escalation, given the low levels of organization and strategic coordination that still hamper popular forces. While disruption on the streets and in workplaces certainly wrestled the promise of a plebiscite, it was only those at the highest echelons of state power who could have granted the concession. And in other work, you talk about the importance of mobilizational resources and structural leverage.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's the question's both specific to Chile, but in a more broader sense as well. How strong are protests, and when does the left want to be utilizing protests?
Yeah, I think. Well, let me just say something about the particular situation that passage that you read was responding to. There was a lot of criticism, and then I'll use that to jump to the bigger question. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of criticism, in November of 2019, right, of the left congressional figures that signed on to this agreement, right? That opened the way for the plebiscite, firstly, and secondly, the constituent elections, and now the assembly. Because there was this sense that mobilization and protests on the street was so strong and so disruptive, and it was. There's no doubt about that. That's the only reason we got this concession, right? Because of the cost imposed by the disruption on the street, the disruption in neighborhoods, the disruption to the economy that this rebellion imposed. But there was the sense that that type of mobilization alone could have continued and accomplished bringing down the regime. The Frente Amplio Congress people who signed on were accused of saving Piñera's ass because he was about to fall, right? And we should have let the revolution occur on the street. The fact is, perhaps because they were so strong, because the rebellion, this mass insurgency was so powerful and it had rocked the government so dramatically, it probably could have brought down Piñera, right? But then what? It would not have had the wherewithal, right, to take over, to topple the entire regime and build a new one, right? And that's where the limit, unless you're striving for a Bolshevik type takeover and revolution, which I think is off the agenda for a number of reasons, right? That's where the weakness of that type of approach, I think, is most notable. Instead, what I think movements need, and this is what has occurred, not as strongly as perhaps we'd like, but this is what's happening in Chile right now. Instead, what we need to do is find some kind of transmission mechanisms from mass social movements and mobilization on the street, right, to the levers of power, to state institutions, right, so that that mobilization, that disruption coming from below can actually translate into institutional change, institutional transformation. And that is exactly what the movement achieved in Chile through that agreement, through that concession by the state, right, or from the state. And so one of the, I think, ways of using this insight, if you find it to be insightful, that is, right, is to now look at the situation, in the assembly. There's a lot of praise and celebration for these independent lists, right, because they represent the grassroots, the more autonomous networks of community movements and social movements, right, and they will be the ones who will be able to refound the Chilean democracy, right? I'm somewhat skeptical of that. If these independent, quote unquote, independent movements, right, and their grassroots affiliates and organizations don't find ways to team up, right, with more organized parties and institutions that have programmatic and strategic vision and discipline, right? I fear that all that energy, all that potential might be lost. Just to give you a slight taste of this, a sense of this, right? These independent lists in Chile, right? It wasn't just one standard across the board from north to south slate, right? It was really fragmented throughout. And as a result, because they couldn't coordinate a single slate, much less coordinate with this new left slate, right? As a result, about 10% of the vote was just squandered. And we could have had an additional 10% of the delegates on our side had there been better coordination with these quote unquote independence, grassroots, social movement forces. And I think we can project the same kind of concern moving forward in terms of the role they might play and how they might better articulate with partisan forces.
I want to ask about the Frente Amplio and just kind of like what's their deal? Like, what kind of party is it? Like, what are the differences between them and the Communist Party? Like, if I'm some Chilean guy and I'm sampling the parties, what would make me join the Frente Amplio over the Communist Party or vice versa? Are they like a Podemos or in Spain, or what's their deal?
Yeah, it's a good question. And first of all, I'm really happy that they've come together and they in this alliance with the communists, because there seem to be these two kind of distinct paths that had too many differences to come together. So it's for Chilean politics and for the prospects of democratizing Chilean society, right, and for social justice outcomes. It's really, really a great development that the Frente Amplio has joined the communist and coalition. But who or what is the Frente Amplio? Frente Amplio really grew out of primarily the mass student mobilizations of 2011, 2012. Those were the first huge, mass protests that rocked the post-authoritarian regime in Chile, and it spawned new organizations, new political figures, and the elections that followed in 2013 saw a few of them elected to Congress, somehow breaking through this duopoly, right? That's actually that's enshrined in Pinochet's 1980 constitution, because it pretty much reserves all representation for the top two forces per district, right? But these new movements and their leaders had such an impact through those mobilizations that a few of them broke through. Some were communist, some were not communist. Some they described themselves as autonomist or Gramscian, all kinds of stuff, right? But they said, we won't.
Pete Buttigieg's dad.
What's that?
Pete Buttigieg's dad is one of the leaders. Yeah.
Well, yeah. The difference is that these guys actually were part of a mass movement, right, on the street. But so when these new young leaders were elected to Congress, the communists, and there are a couple of communists among them, decided to make an alliance with the center left. What, in my view, what really distinguishes the Frente Amplio, besides the fact that they emerged from these new mass protests, is that they were completely opposed to not just the right and center right, but the center left as well, because they correctly saw them as the managers of Chilean neoliberalism, right? And so they preserved that independence and kept building their organizations. From student organizations, they went on to have influence in teachers' unions. From there into other sectors, et cetera, et cetera. So that by the 2017 elections, right? And this is, again, a force that had just come together as a formal alliance in 2014. By 2017, they won 20% of the first round vote in the presidential elections, right? So they kind of established themselves as a new left in Chile. To be distinguished from the old hard, if you want to say hard left, to differentiate from the center left, right, which were the communists, right? Mm-hmm. Communists by then had lost its mass base that it historically had in Chile's working class, because it had been marginalized from the transition process and from these negotiations. It had really become a force, an extremely weak force in Chilean politics. They experienced a revitalization both through their participation in the mass student movement, but then through some local victories, primarily Daniel Jadwe's victory in one of the Santiago townships in Recoleta. And he's done quite well. And so that has bolstered communist credibility, because, you know, he's governed in very pragmatic ways, but delivered some real reforms for poor and working people in Recoleta. And so then, you know, they come together, and all the, or not all, but many of the Chileans who have, of course, come to reject the old regime, and by that rejecting both the center left and the center right, see in this new alliance as a viable formation that can move things forward.
Well, so my last question is actually harkens back to that old hard left, because as you've written, the social base for kind of the classic left in Latin America, much like, you know, the left around the world, was historically working class, industrial, and manufacturing. Not everywhere exactly the same, but that's typically kind of been, concentrated workers, somewhat skilled, that have a good deal of structural leverage in the economy, that they're important for the process of corporations and capitalists making profits, so that when they do fight back, the punch hits that much harder. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that, as you know very well, because I'm about to put up a figure from one of your pieces, so much of employment across Latin America is informal work, meaning it's not the standard contract between a worker and a boss that, maybe it's more typical, although becoming a little bit less so in the global north. But across the continent, you have these very high levels of workers who are, it's some form of part-time work, or it's like what we know as gig work. It might just be kind of making ends meet in their particular communities. And I mean, one of the things that's obviously very shocking about this graphic, which is actually from a different piece that you wrote, is kind of how flat so many of these lines are across the continent, right, despite the amount of political change that's happened over the last several decades. But at the very bottom, with those triangles, is Chile. That Chile has among the lowest levels of informality, or informal work rather, on the continent. And so, thinking ahead of the outcome of the plebiscite, of a left being renewed in Chile or across the continent. I mean, there's massive transformations happening across the continent right now. How should we understand the actual social base of a left-wing project going forward? And to what extent does that kind of give us indicators of how successful these efforts might end up being?
Yeah, to me, this is the key question, right, for the future, not just of the left in Latin America, but for politics and development more generally in the region. This, in my opinion, is the core handicap of the left right now in the region, that its key constituencies, right, that it relies on, that it mobilizes, or that mobilize on their own, have come from the most peripheral, most marginal sections of the working class, mainly the informal sector, right? And for instance, in the pink tide countries, those left governments that emerged in the early 2000s into the mid 2000s, right? Their main bases of support were informal sector workers and communities, right? And they did propel them to power, and they did bring down old government, neoliberal governments, right? The problem, as you pointed out, Kale, is that while they might be able to forge new organizations and coordinate fairly massive mobilizations, they lack the kind of leverage that the old constituencies of the left used to have, in which they used to deploy, right, in order to really put a strain on the system, right, to really, really impose costly disruptions on the system. And that, what we call structural leverage, was rooted in their position in the industries that elites valued the most. Well, if your backers now are working in food stands, or somehow in gigs, freelancing from day to day, right? First of all, they're not working in industries that, if they somehow find ways to disrupt them, will really hit elite interests hard. If you decide one day not to show up to your sandwich stand, elites aren't going to really care. It's not imposing, cost on them. And on top of that, this is the most atomized, the most scattered, right? These are the most atomized, the most scattered portions of the working class. You're working on your own, getting by on your own. It's a hyper-competitive environment just to survive. So it's hard to, forge these bonds with like-minded people and communities, right? And come together around a shared project. And this is the challenge that the left in Latin America, and I guess the world over, has to somehow overcome. The left shouldn't reject, of course, right, the involvement, participation of informal workers, especially if they're rebelling. I mean, how would we reject that? That's what happened in Chile in October 2019, right? It accomplished quite a bit. Mm-hmm. But we have to go beyond that and find ways to organize sectors of the working class that do, because of where they work, the sectors they work in, their job sites, have this built-in ability to disrupt elites and their profits and their interests, right? The figures that you showed there, in terms of the Chilean scenario, are a bit too optimistic. Later on in that very, very long essay, I show that more accurately about 40% of Chileans, 40 to 45%, toil in the informal sector, right? And that means that most of Chilean workers are scattered throughout society and the economy, and we have to find, branches of industry, geographic locations, right, where there are larger concentrations of workers, right, who work in key nodes of the economy, where if they stop working, right, they can really, really hit business profits hard. And I think Chile does offer some promising prospects. Along with the rise of mass protest, this renewed cycle of mobilization that started around 2010, right, there has also been a revitalized labor insurgency. It's been patchy, uneven, right? But thankfully, it's also happened in key sectors of the Chilean economy. In mining, for instance, Chile is a country that continues to depend on natural resources, primarily on copper and copper exports, right? Well, there has been some new organizing and rebellions in copper since then. In the ports, I mean, after you dig up the mineral, the copper, you got to ship them to ports, and from there, transport them out to the world, to China, the US, what have you, right? Well, there have been very, very powerful dock worker campaigns, organizing campaigns and strikes over the last 5 or 6 years, right? And so what I think the new left, the new partisan left, and thankfully it is consolidating itself. It has established itself in this new alliance between the communists and the Frente Amplio. What it has to do is find ways to go beyond the layers it already works with, students, impoverished professionals, or whatever you want to call them, middle-class urban sectors, and find ways to connect to these newly rebelling working class sectors that have this kind of structural leverage. One of the implications of that is that, when it comes to, for instance, thinking about the role that these independents, both the independent delegates in the constituent assemblies and these independent, autonomous, horizontalist, more, networks and movements on the ground, when it comes to thinking of the role they'll play, right? We have to really pose this question and think about it hard. Are they the sectors that are going to get us over the hump? Surely they have a lot to contribute. But as you mentioned earlier, Kale, do these middle-class women who've, again, they've been great in mobilizing this way, right? Millions of people on the street, and they can paralyze the capital in a day. Mm-hmm. Or do these retired workers who are just barely scraping by, no longer working in industry, by definition, they're retired, right? But they mobilize 1 million, 1.5 million people in their biggest demonstrations as well, right? Will these be the sectors that will really be able to confront any resistance by the old neoliberal elites, right? When it comes to legislating universalist reforms, like, a public healthcare system, like real public universal education for all, including for the children of the poor, et cetera, et cetera. Will they be the ones that will be able to, band with us and push that through? We'll have to see. What we do know is that if this new partisan left, which again is strong in one sense, it has occupied some institutional positions, and that's really important, but is weak in another sense. It lacks these deeply rooted constituencies, right, in the working class. Will they be able to really push hard and face the resistance of both the Concertación neoliberal elites and the new right? By the way, I say new right because the right is reinventing itself right now, trying to. Mm-hmm. Will they be able to without relying on that structural power of these newly rebelling sectors of the working class? I'm pretty skeptical about it.
Right. It's kind of the double bind that we have in the U.S. as well right now, where it's to revitalize the left, you probably need something like an industrial policy. And in order to implement an industrial policy, you probably need to have the left in power. And it's the same thing in the U.S. here. We've been talking about with like the PRO Act. To pass the PRO Act, you would probably need to have a revitalized labor movement. To have a revitalized labor movement, you probably need to like rip apart so much of the draconian labor law that we have on the books right now.
Yeah, no, but again, the difference is we won a constituent assembly. So that can be written into the new constitution, right? Labor rights. Chile is so backward when it comes to, and so pro-employer when it comes to labor legislation and labor law, right? Well, this is why winning the plebiscite, winning the assembly, electing a new lefty really, really matters, precisely because, we can now shift the balance, as it were, in workplaces in ways that allow rebelling workers to organize much more effectively and then deploy, right, this potential power that they have. It's going to be tough, right? Mm-hmm. But it's on the agenda for the first time in about 50 years.
Wow. All right. Well, René Rojas, thank you so much for joining us. This was fascinating. It's hard to find windows of opportunity for the left around the world these days. This certainly seems like a very big one. And we'll definitely be watching it as it unfolds. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. It's good talking to you.
Thanks, René.